Welcome to Rethinking Pre-Participation Screening, New Perspectives on Injury Prevention. I'm Travis Pollen. I'm an assistant professor of exercise science at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, where my research focuses on how injuries happen and how we can prevent them, and especially the role that pre-participation screening plays in that process. I have a master's degree in biomechanics and a PhD in rehabilitation sciences. I've been a personal trainer for about 12 years, and my athletic background is as an adaptive swimmer. I was born missing my left leg, so that's why I was an adaptive swimmer. And my swimming background really informs a lot of the research that I do, as well as the examples that I give in this presentation. And this presentation, this topic is a favorite of mine because it helps me bridge the gap between research and practice, as well as between research, or as well as between rehabilitation and performance. This talk has 5 sections. In the first section, I'll give some background on injuries and injury prevention and pre-participation screening. And I'm specifically focusing on the musculoskeletal component of the pre-participation screening process. There are other components too, like cardiovascular screening and concussion screening and dental as well, but that's beyond the scope of this talk. So after that background, I'll go into why pre-participation screening can't predict injuries. And then I'll go into some alternative strategies for injury prevention beyond pre-participation screening. And then I'll share why pre-participation screening can still be useful, if not for injury prevention. And then some sample or one sample application to swimming in particular. As everybody knows, injuries are a very big problem. There is a statistic from 2003 that says that 7 million Americans get injured playing sports every single year, which is about the same as the population of the state of Arizona. So although this statistic is about 20 years old, I think it's pretty unlikely that these injury rates have budged appreciably in the time between. If we look at injury rates in high school and college sports across 15-year time spans, we can see these plots for competition injury rates in blue and practice injury rates underneath in gray. And what we see is that for both high school and college sports, the injury rates are relatively flatlined across those 15-year periods. So with so many injuries, one might wonder whether we should just stop playing sports. And of course, the answer to that question is no, because sports have lots of benefits, right? People who engage in physical activity live longer, and they're less likely to develop injuries. And there are also social perks too, like the sense of community and inclusion and connection. For kids, sports can be a great way to build self-esteem and patience and teamwork. But with those benefits come injuries, and sometimes those injuries can have far-reaching consequences. So things like long-term musculoskeletal impairments, as well as psychosocial and financial impacts, and impaired performance at the individual and team level. And even beyond those, there are other consequences of injuries too, like missed opportunities or even forced early retirement from your sport. So in general, the health benefits are considered to outweigh the risks and consequences of injuries, but we still want to minimize them as much as we can. Ben Franklin was famously quoted as saying, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And one way we can apply this to the injury prevention context is to think about the best way to minimize the consequences of injury being to avoid getting injured in the first place. And one approach to injury prevention is believed to be pre-participation screening, which is the topic for this lecture. Just a quick note on terminology. Every so often you hear someone remark that injury prevention is not an accurate term because it's not possible to prevent all injuries. We can only reduce risk. So some more accurate terms could be things like injury risk reduction or injury risk management or mitigation or injury control. And I just want to point out that this is not a new debate. The first instance that I saw this discussed was in a paper from 1995, actually. So almost 30 years ago, right? And I certainly appreciate accuracy of terms, but I don't get hung up on this one in particular because to me, you don't have to prevent all injuries to call it injury prevention. You just have to prevent some. And plus, injury prevention is universally recognized and understood. So I use that term throughout this presentation. So let's get into pre-participation screening for the purpose of identifying high-risk athletes. And as I just alluded to, one approach to injury prevention is thought to be pre-participation screening, which has been defined as a strategy for detecting a future condition in a person who doesn't currently have signs and symptoms of that condition. So basically, it's an attempt to identify athletes who are at risk of an injury and intervene on them. And this is like the holy grail of injury prevention, to predict who's going to get injured and intervene on them before that happens. It's usually conducted in the preseason, so that's why we call it pre-participation, before the athlete has officially started training and competing. And in sports, we have other names for it too. Sometimes we call it the periodic health evaluation or the pre-participation exam. And I have the picture of the fortune teller here because it's kind of like fortune telling. You're looking into your crystal ball at athletes who are currently healthy and trying to predict whether they'll develop an injury. This idea that you can screen athletes to predict and prevent injury is obviously very attractive. And in theory, here's how the process would work. You would start by identifying the risk factors that are particular to the sport that you're working with. So maybe that's muscle weakness or range of motion restrictions or a lack of balance or stability or something about the way the athlete moves. And then you would conduct your pre-participation screen to identify those risk factors. And then you would stratify your athletes based on athletes who perform poorly on the pre-participation screen. You would label them as being high risk. And then you would give your injury prevention program to those high risk athletes. So this process is exactly what many experts recommend. But over the next few minutes, I hope to convince you of why this approach falls short. And the explanation that I'll share is heavily influenced by this critical review paper from 2016 by Roald Barr. So if you have not read this paper, I really highly recommend it. There's no shortage of musculoskeletal screening tests out there. Some examples of which include the functional movement screen, the Y balance test, landing error scoring system, drop vertical jump, tuck jump, single leg squat, quad hamstring isokinetic strength, and many more. And many of these tests were specifically designed for the purpose that I just described of predicting and stratifying. And in an ideal world, the way that this would work is this. So you would conduct your screening test and you would get your athletes' scores. They would come out on this nice bell-shaped curve with higher performers to the right side of the curve and lower performers to the left. And this screening test would perfectly identify those athletes who go on to get injured, the ones in red here, as being high risk based on their low test scores. And then we would intervene on that high risk group. This hypothetical situation would represent perfect prediction like fortune telling. Unfortunately, in the real world, we never get such a clean split with all of the injured athletes to the left of the cutoff line and all of the uninjured athletes to the right. Instead, what we see in the real world is a situation that looks more like this, with the injured athletes tending towards the left of the line, but being scattered all throughout. So if you read a study with the data depicted here, the headline for that study would say that injury is 3.5 times more likely in the high risk group than the low risk group. And I put the calculations here on the left side of the screen. The way that I determined this was I looked at the proportion of athletes who got injured in the high risk group. So that was 9 out of 16 over here. And then I did the same thing for the low risk group. That was 7 out of 44. So 9 out of 16 is 56%, 7 out of 44 is 16%. And when I divide 56% by 16%, I get this relative risk or risk ratio of 3.5. So that's where that number comes from. Just a important statistical and terminological point here. When we see this increased likelihood of injury in the high-risk group compared to the low-risk group, this is called a statistical association between the screening test and injury. This is not injury prediction, and that's despite what many authors of research papers report in those papers. So they often call it prediction, but it's actually not prediction. For true prediction, you would need a much higher relative risk or risk ratio than 3.5 for your screen to cleanly separate those groups and predict injury on an individual basis. Okay, so now that we've stratified into our high risk and low risk groups, it seems like the next step would be to intervene on the high risk group. And if we did that and we measured their scores again after the intervention, we would expect that their scores would improve, and maybe we could get everybody or most everybody up over that cutoff score. The problem with this is, what about all of these people in the low risk group who get injured? We call these false negatives. They were negative on our test because they scored above the cutoff, but they're false negatives because they went on to get injured. So wouldn't these people also benefit from receiving the intervention? And this is actually an age-old problem in epidemiology called the prevention paradox, where many times the majority of injuries or illnesses happen to people who are in the low-risk group because of the sheer number of people in that low-risk group. So one thing that we could try now is to move the cutoff score to a different spot on the curve in an attempt to better separate the high and low-risk groups. So let's try moving the cutoff score here. We would still get a reasonably compelling headline that injury is 2.6 times more likely in the high-risk group compared to the low-risk group. And now our test would be capturing almost everybody who gets injured, all these red figures to the left of the cutoff line. But it's also identifying a lot more athletes who aren't going to get injured as being high risk. We have more of these gray figures to the left of the line. So we call these guys false positives. They're positive because they scored below the cutoff score on our test, but they're false because they don't go on to get injured. Hopefully from this exercise, you can see that there's nowhere where we can place the cutoff score to cleanly separate the injured and the uninjured athletes, so that all the injured athletes are to the left of the line and all of the uninjured athletes are to the right. I'm a numbers person, so let's put some numbers to these concepts, which we call sensitivity and specificity. So sensitivity is the ability of our test to correctly identify injured athletes as being high risk, and specificity is the ability of the test to correctly identify uninjured athletes as being low risk. With our cutoff score number 1, we correctly captured only 9 out of the 16 athletes who got injured, or 56%. But we did correctly capture 84% of those who didn't get injured. So we call this situation with 56% sensitivity low sensitivity, because that number is relatively low. And if we intervened on only the high-risk group here, we would miss out on helping a lot of athletes who would benefit from getting the intervention. If we did that same calculations for cutoff score number 2, now we're correctly capturing 94% of the athletes who get injured, but with this more sensitive cutoff score, we get a lot more false positives. So we call this situation low specificity because 18% is low. In this case, we would be giving the injury prevention program to everyone below the cutoff score, and in doing so, we would be giving it to a lot of athletes who don't actually need it. For a screening test to cleanly separate groups and predict injury on an individual basis, we would need both high sensitivity and high specificity, like over 90% for both of them. Instead, what we see with all screening tests is this trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So when it comes to injury prevention, we have to decide what's more important to us. Is it prioritizing sensitivity or prioritizing specificity? Because again, we can't have both with any screening test that currently exists. And another way to think about this is which has more downside, giving a prevention program to a lot of people who didn't actually need it, like cutoff score number 2, or not giving it to a lot of people who do need it, like cutoff score number 1. So if we want to prevent the most injuries, what we should do is prioritize sensitivity, or cutoff score number 2, because there's not much downside to giving a prevention program to people who don't actually need it. Because the primary mode of injury prevention is exercise, and there really aren't any negative side effects of exercise. In fact, it enhances athletic performance. And this is different from other branches of medicine where an intervention like a mastectomy, for example, would be risky and expensive. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, what about whatever your favorite screening test is? And I can assure you that the story is the same for all of these tests. And that's contrary to what sometimes the creators of those tests claim. What we have here is an association between injury and the test. Scoring poorly on the test might increase an athlete's risk, but it doesn't predict injury because association and prediction are not the same. How about previous injury, which we consider the strongest risk factor for a new one? In the previous examples that we looked at, the screening tests gave us continuous data, and we had to place that cutoff point arbitrarily to differentiate between high risk and low risk. But previous injury is nice because it provides a cleaner cutoff. You either had an injury or you didn't, and we don't have to place that cutoff. So if you had these sample data, the headline for this study would read that injury was 4.2 times more likely in the group with a previous injury than the group without the previous injury. And based on this seemingly strong association, if we use these data to decide who needed the injury prevention, we would unfortunately not give it to 1 in 4 of the athletes who go on to get injured. So it turns out that even previous injury isn't strong enough to call it a true predictor, since so many injuries happen to athletes without the risk factor, the ones who don't have previous injuries. So with this in mind, maybe we should just give the injury prevention program to everyone. And I'll have more to say about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about a few reasons why screening tests can't predict injury. So what I'm about to show is a model for how injuries happen. And this model starts with risk factors that are internal or within the athlete. These are things like older age, previous injuries, and it includes things we can screen for, like physical fitness or anatomical factors. The model also includes external risk factors that are specific to the sport, like the environment, playing on a slippery surface, or extreme weather conditions, or maybe it's something about the equipment that's used in the sport. All of these internal and external risk factors affect one another and interact in what's called a web of determinants. And this web of determinants describes the athlete's risk profile. Then when they play the sport, they either get injured or they don't get injured. If they do get injured, they rehab, hopefully return back to a healthy state. And when they're healthy, they go back and play their sport again. But when they do that, they have adapted from a fitness standpoint based on their previous exposure. And they've also negatively adapted from a fatigue standpoint in the short term from that exposure. And that positive adaptation from the fitness standpoint and the negative adaptation from a fatigue standpoint will modify that risk profile so that their risk profile has changed when they go and play their sport again. So what this model illustrates is just how complicated injuries are. And when we think about this multifactorial nature, we realize that we shouldn't expect a single screening test to predict injury, because whatever we're measuring in that pre-participation screen is just one quality within this overall risk profile. And there are so many different factors that can contribute to injury. So knowing that one screening test alone can't possibly be enough, you might wonder, what if we stacked a bunch of risk factors together? Would a multifactorial model improve our ability to predict injury? At least that's what I wondered until I found this study from 2015 on 188 US Army Rangers looking at risk factors for musculoskeletal injuries. In this study, they looked at 8 different risk factors, things like smoking, previous injuries, missed time, ankle range of motion, asymmetries, pain during movement, and a couple of performance measures. And what I'm plotting here now is the number of rangers versus the number of risk factors they had through the screening. And I couldn't fit 188 stick figures on this slide, so each stick figure represents about 10 rangers in the study. And the rangers had anywhere from 0 to 6 of the risk factors, with most having somewhere between 3 and 4. So here's the distribution of the rangers who sustained injuries in the study. And as you can see, they're spread throughout the number of risk factors from 0 to 6. And one thing that I should mention here is that the interpretation of this horizontal axis is reversed compared to the ones that we were looking at before, because now the higher performers, the ones who are low risk, are towards the left of the line because they have fewer risk factors, and the lower performers, the ones who are higher risk, are towards the right. So we can look at a couple of different cutoff scores. For example, if we cut off at 3 or more risk factors, they found 88% specificity. So with this cutoff score, you would not be intervening on most of the people who won't get injured, which minimizes waste. But we only get 38% sensitivity here, so we would be missing the majority of the people who do get injured. We could look at another cutoff score, so cutting off at more than 1 or more risk factors. Now we would have 89% sensitivity, so we would be capturing almost 9 in 10 of the injured rangers to the right of this cutoff score as high risk, but now we only have 10% specificity. So we are wasting a lot of resources intervening on people who don't need the intervention. Hopefully this is looking and sounding familiar. The short answer to whether we can predict injury better when we combine multiple risk factors is no. We still have this trade-off between sensitivity and specificity. So when we're trying to predict injury, when you combine a bunch of risk factors that are associated with injury but don't predict it, it only improves our prediction ability slightly. We still don't have both high sensitivity and high specificity. So even accounting for 8 risk factors, there are still too many other factors that we're not accounting for. Now, if we're optimistic about the pace of advancements with artificial intelligence and machine learning, we might one day get there with prediction, but not yet. Remember from this model also how the athletes were adapting from a fitness standpoint positively, as well as from a negative standpoint from a short-term fatigue perspective every time they train and compete? Well, this is another reason why pre-participation screening can't possibly predict injury, because these athletes are always changing. Imagine that you had a hypothetical athlete A here, and let's say the data represent strength that we measure every couple of weeks throughout the season. So let's say the dashed line here is like an average strength value. In this case, athlete A would have measured low in the preseason in August on their strength. And then we can see that over the next couple of months, let's say they engage in a strength training program, they get stronger, they maintain over a couple months until boom, they get injured in November. And at the time of the injury, they were actually strong. But if we only had the August preseason measurement and none of the more recent measurements, we might not realize that weakness we might think that weakness contributed to their injury, but that wouldn't be the case because they actually weren't weak at the time of the injury. So now let's imagine hypothetical athlete B. Athlete B measured high in strength in the preseason, but then let's say they got sick a few times over the course of the season, and their strength dropped here and here and here. So finally, they get injured just before February. And again, if we only had their preseason measurement and didn't have any of these more recent measurements, we wouldn't know that weakness at the time of the injury might have contributed to that injury because we thought that they were strong because we had that preseason measurement. So the point here is that the way the athlete looks in the preseason could be very different from the way they look at the time of the injury, especially if the injury is several months later. So preseason screening is just a snapshot in time, and that's only so useful for qualities like strength and flexibility, given how much they can fluctuate with training and with fatigue from training. What this suggests is that we should be favoring monitoring these qualities on a more consistent or repeated basis. So can we get these measurements every month or every week? Or are there certain things that we can measure even every day instead of just that preseason time point alone? Okay, let's recap what we have so far, which is first that pre-participation screening does not predict injury. We have a statistical association between the test and injury sometimes, but that's not the same thing as prediction. And that's because no screening test or combination of tests has both high sensitivity and high specificity. We just have this trade-off between catching the most injuries with sensitivity and avoiding false positives with specificity. We also talked about how preseason screening can't predict injury because injuries are too multifactorial and complicated, and because that pre-participation time point is just one snapshot of our athletes who are constantly evolving. And finally, we talked about the epidemiological prevention paradox, where stratifying and intervening on just the high-risk athletes will unfortunately withhold the intervention from many of the low-risk athletes who will go on to get injured. So now that we've debunked the ability of these tests to predict injury, what should we be doing for injury prevention? In this next section, I'm going to present two alternatives to the risk stratification approach. Before I do that, I just have to explain a concept called injury burden, which is the combination of the severity of an injury and the likelihood of an injury. So I'll use swimming as an example. And to orient ourselves to these axes, we have the likelihood of the injury on the horizontal axis, ranging from rare all the way to almost certain. Then we have the severity of the injury on the vertical axis, ranging from insignificant all the way up to catastrophic. So the injuries that are most burdensome are going to be the ones that are to the topmost and rightmost. And from most burdensome to least in swimming, we have swimmer's shoulder, which is fairly likely and can be pretty major in terms of keeping athletes out of practice and competition for a long period of time. Then we have low back and neck pain, elbow pain, and breaststroker's knee. These are a little less likely than swimmer's shoulder and not as severe. And then on the extremes, we have things like bumps and bruises, which you might not expect in a non-contact sport like swimming if you're not familiar with it. But when you put a lot of tall athletes in one crowded lane, and they're swimming past each other, they tend to run into each other. So that is almost certain, but relatively harmless. And then we get these rare but severe concussions from time to time. So when we're designing an injury prevention program, what we want to do is prioritize those top rightmost injuries, the ones in darker red, because they represent the bigger injury problem. Okay, so now that we've got injury burden down, let's go back and revisit that idea of going with cutoff score number 2, which gave us the higher sensitivity. If we took the risk stratification approach here and we intervened on everyone to the left of the line, we would be intervening on 51 out of the 60 athletes, or about 85%. At this point, if we're going to intervene on almost everyone, why not just intervene on everybody? We would save ourselves the time and trouble of screening and money as well. And that can be a major selling point for practitioners with high athlete loads. And if we gave the intervention to everyone, we would expect that we would be improving everyone on whatever quality we're intervening on. So in contrast to the high risk approach, this is called a global approach, or sometimes a population approach or a mass approach, where instead of targeting the high risk individuals, we consider the entire population of athletes as high risk just as a result of playing their sport. And this is exactly what Roald Barr concluded in his 2016 review paper. He said that we prevent the most injuries by simply giving the injury prevention program to everyone, or taking that global approach. So when it comes to screening, is there any point to doing it? And there's one downside to this all that I don't see discussed in the literature, which is that time is finite. In fact, when we interview athletes, coaches, and sports medicine practitioners about what some of the biggest barriers to implementing an injury prevention program are, they always say time is the most significant barrier for them. So we can't give every athlete every exercise to prevent every injury. So what are we supposed to do? My proposed solution for this issue of time, where we can't give every athlete every prevention exercise, is what I call a hybrid approach. And this hybrid approach is based on that burden of injury, which is the combination of the likelihood and severity. So what I propose is that for the most burdensome injuries, we take a global approach where we have all of the athletes do the prevention exercises for those burdensome injuries. And maybe that accounts for somewhere between 60 or 80% of the program. This could be an existing injury prevention program that's well researched, like the 11 plus for soccer, or maybe it's something that we design ourselves. And if you're interested about going down that rabbit hole about the pros and cons of existing injury prevention programs versus designing your own, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to chat about that. Then for the less burdensome injuries, we take what I call a tailored approach, where we just have subsets of athletes do these exercises. So this is where pre-participation screening can play a role if you have the resources to conduct it, where we're tailoring these exercises to the high-risk athletes based on their screening results. Maybe they have multiple risk factors for a particular injury through a couple of different screening tests, or maybe they have one screening test that they're scoring really extremely low on. And again, maybe this accounts for somewhere between 20 and 40% of the program. So for these lower burden injuries, we can be more selective and only intervene on those athletes who are most at risk and avoid unnecessary interventions. Let's apply this to swimming again. Remember from our risk matrix, the higher burden injuries were to the top and rightmost. So we would have our global components that every athlete would do. So in this example, both swimmers A and B would get injury prevention exercises for their shoulders and low back and neck, because these are the highest burden injuries. And then the tailored components would be just for the high risk athletes. So swimmer A would be doing the elbow injury prevention exercises and swimmer B would be doing the knee injury prevention exercises. Maybe swimmer A had a couple of screening tests show up as positive for elbow risk, and maybe swimmer B had a really extreme score on a knee injury screen. So not only does this hybrid approach save us time, but it also might create more buy-in from the athletes and motivation to do the program because they know that it's tailored to them. To recap all the different approaches that we've talked about, we talked about the high-risk approach where we were targeting the most susceptible athletes only, which is an efficient use of our prevention resources, but the con is that we have false negatives where we're missing many athletes who would benefit from the intervention. Then we talked about the global approach where we're intervening on everybody. This has the broadest impact. It's the simplest because it doesn't require any screening, but the downside is that the intervention is resource and time intensive and it's one size fits all. So this uniform prevention program might not address the specific needs of individual athletes, might overlook particular vulnerabilities that they have. So the hybrid approach is the best of both worlds because it combines the efficiency of the high-risk approach with the broad coverage of the global approach. Okay, so even though pre-participation screening shouldn't be used for injury prediction, it can be used, as we just talked about, to inform the tailored components of the injury prevention program. And it's also useful in a couple other ways too, which I'll talk about now, which are detecting current injuries, developing relationships with athletes, and gathering baseline data. So let's start with this idea of detecting current injuries. So instead of trying to predict injuries, we are just looking for ones that are there right now. So what we're looking for might be previous injuries that weren't fully rehabbed, or trying to detect early on new problems that we haven't previously detected and try to prevent them from getting worse. So we know that athletes tend to wait to visit the medical team until a problem gets really big. And ideally, in most cases, we want to know about it before that. So hopefully this early detection can prevent things from getting worse. And this is actually exactly what a study from 2016 out of Qatar did with professional footballers or soccer players, where they looked for any condition that required treatment, further assessment, or follow-up. And what they found was about 1 in 3 of their athletes had a current musculoskeletal condition, which I think is a pretty high number. Now, if your injury surveillance program is good, you should already know about those problems. But as we said, athletes are often slow to report new problems and they can fly under the radar. So this pre-participation screen is a great time to catch up on those things. Also, if you are new to the athletes or the athletes are new to you, maybe they're first year student athletes, you wouldn't necessarily know about their past history. Another good reason to screen that's not injury prediction is that this is a great time for the entire sports medicine and performance team to meet the athletes and to get to know the athletes and for them to get to know you and trust you as well. We know that strong relationships improve communication and compliance with our injury prevention efforts as well as our rehab efforts. So it's not ideal if the first time an athlete meets a member of the medical team is when they're already injured. And lastly, we have this broad category of gathering baseline data, which I have 4 subcategories to. 1 is progression, 2 is monitoring, 3 is effectiveness, and 4 is clearance. And I'll go through each of these one by one, starting with progression. So this is the idea that screening can also dictate some of the programming in terms of the loads and the starting points for our exercise progressions and really make things more individualized. For example, if you were doing a Copenhagen adductor plank with your athletes and you had 3 different levels, ranging from level 1, which is a bent knee supported with the bottom leg, to level 2, having the bent knee but the bottom leg unsupported, and then 3, a long lever unsupported. If we had strength measures for the adductors for our athletes in the preseason, that could help dictate which level the athlete should start at, making things a little more seamless and making sure that the exercises are targeted to the appropriate level for each individual athlete. We can also use the screening test as the starting point for an athlete monitoring program to try to identify potential red flags on an ongoing basis. So remember from before, we talked about how the pre-participation screening is just one time point and our athletes are constantly evolving. So that's one reason it doesn't work well for predicting injury because the athlete doesn't necessarily have the same risk profile right before the injury as they did in the preseason. So we said that lended itself to the idea that we should be measuring or monitoring these things on a more ongoing basis, maybe monthly, weekly, or even daily, really as often as possible or realistic in your setting. So this ongoing athlete monitoring can help us understand how ready an athlete is to train on a particular day, or another way to think about that would be how recovered they are. And hopefully it can flag athletes who are under recovered. So we might apply this, for example, by taking daily or weekly grip strength measures or vertical jump measures, let's say like before practice on a given day. And we can use a traffic light system where green means that they're good to go from a training and competition standpoint. Yellow means that we should proceed with caution, and red is a more full stop. So let's say we measure the athlete on a particular day and their measurement is relatively close to their baseline, maybe within 15% of their normal value or like within 2 standard deviations. That would mean that they are good to go. But let's say that there's a large deviation from their average value. In this case, we might, if resources allow, try retesting them later on that day. And if their measurement is back to their normal, then they're good to go. Or if they're still measuring low a second time, or maybe just one low measurement, we go and do a deeper clinical examination. And maybe we find that they're actually injured and we need to hold them out from practice to prevent that injury from worsening. Or maybe we find that they're not injured, but they're just under recovered and we need to manage their loads. So maybe that's reducing the number of high-speed running drills that they're doing or sprinting that they're doing in the course of a practice, or
reducing the number of change of direction drills that they're doing, whatever is the context of whatever within the context of the planned session that the coach has that day. So where the pre-participation screen comes in is that it represents one data point, the first data point for this more longitudinal or serial testing. We can also use pre-participation screening to determine how effective our injury prevention program is at some intermediate time point before the end of the season to make sure that we are actually mitigating the risk factors that we're intending to. So the true effectiveness of the injury prevention program is largely determined on whether we reduce injuries, but we won't have that data until the end of the season to be able to compare from one season to the previous one. So one way that we can tell if our injury prevention program is working before that is to use improvement on the test as a proxy. So let's say that after 8 weeks of running the injury prevention program, we retest our athletes and we compare to those preseason measures. If we've improved the scores in our groups, then that tells us that our injury prevention is working as intended. But if we haven't, then we should reevaluate that prevention program to make sure that we are getting the most impact that we can. And finally, we can use it to help inform our return to sport clearance decision-making for athletes who do get injured. And usually the status quo for this is comparing from a return to sport testing standpoint is to use the uninjured leg or arm as the basis for comparison. So what typically happens is we calculate what's called a limb symmetry index, where we divide the injured side by the uninjured side for a measure like strength or power. And we're looking for at least 90% of the injured side compared to the uninjured side. But there's good reason from the research to be suspicious about whether that uninjured leg is actually a good benchmark, because it can detrain during the period of the injury. So even better than comparing to the uninjured side is to have pre-injury numbers from the pre-participation screen. And in this case, we can try to get back to 100% of those pre-injury numbers, or maybe even higher than 100%, considering that we got injured at that previous level in the first place. Okay, so now I'm going to go through what this whole process would look like in general to apply it to a given sport, and I'll continue using swimming as an example. But the way that this would go is you would look at your sport and you would look at your particular level of sport. And you would write up your risk matrix for injury burden. And maybe you would get that data from epidemiological research, or maybe you have good injury surveillance for a team that you work with, and you can look back over a few years and determine that risk burden. And then you would decide which are the higher burden injuries and which are the lower burden injuries within your sport. The next thing you would do would be to figure out what the internal risk factors are that you can modify or things that you can change. And then you would figure out what screening tests to use to try to assess for those risk factors. And ideally, these would be screening tests that have been shown to be associated with injury in the research within your particular sport, or at least a similar sport and level. And then finally, you would conduct your screen and you would design your intervention to mitigate those risk factors, where you would be designing the global components for the higher burden injuries and the tailored components for the lower burden injuries. So I already showed the injury burden for swimming, where the most burdensome injuries are swimmer's shoulder and low back and neck pain. And now what I've added here are the risk factors for injury, which I've broken into the internal and the external risk factors and the modifiable and the non-modifiable ones. So the modifiable internal risk factors would be things like strength and endurance, flexibility and mobility, neuromuscular control, core stability, as well as their stroke mechanics or their swimming technique, which would be something that I would probably leave up to the swim coach unless I had expertise in that. And then I would create my screening battery. And so that screening battery would consist of some questionnaires as well as some pre-participation screening tests. The questionnaires might look at things like previous injuries, swimming experience, what the athletes have been doing recently from a training standpoint, might even look at some psychosocial factors. And then The physical performance stuff would be things like range of motion, stability and control, strength and power of the shoulder, T-spine, scapula, and then some core stability stuff as well. If you're unsure about what any of these tests look like, I made a YouTube playlist which has videos of all of the different tests. So you can scan that QR code and check that out. And then for the injury prevention program, I would design this to be used as a warm-up before swimming or after a little bit of light swimming. So before practice, I would have athletes come in, and some of the athletes would do their knee injury prevention exercises. Some of the athletes would do their elbow injury prevention exercises. Maybe that would be 5 minutes before practice. And then we would come together for the global components, which should take about 15 minutes, about 5 minutes of light swimming, followed by some flexibility and mobility, locomotion drills, core training, and plyos and power to ramp up to swim. So all of these exercises are really geared around things like shoulder and scapular strength and endurance, shoulder flexibility and mobility, core stability, low back strength and mobility, neck mobility, and T-spine mobility, really trying to mitigate the risk factors for the highest burden injuries with the global components. So if you're curious about what any of these exercises look like, I have another YouTube playlist here, and you can scan that QR code. The last thing I want to say about this is that this is not a one-person job. This requires all the members of the multidisciplinary team to be on board, working with the athlete and their sport coach to conduct this pre-participation screening and this ongoing monitoring process. One of us can't do it alone, but when we work together, we can accomplish a lot more. So the take-homes for this talk are, first, that pre-participation screening cannot predict injury, but it can still be useful. Also, my recommendation is for a hybrid approach that compromises between the high risk and the global approaches, where we're prioritizing the global components of the injury prevention program for the highest burden injuries, and then doing some tailoring for the lower burden injuries. And even though injury or pre-participation screening can't predict injury, it's still an important tool for informing those tailored components, as well as early detection of current injuries, fostering strong relationships between athletes and providers, and establishing baseline data as part of an ongoing monitoring program that can help us with progression, as well as the monitoring and determining the effectiveness of our intervention at some intermediate time point, and in the case that an athlete does get injured, help with return to sport clearance decision making. So these are my references from all the slides. And if you have any questions for me, please don't hesitate to contact me via whatever communication platform you prefer. There's my email, there's my website, and I'm also on social media too. So thank you very much for watching.